I think another really helpful thing, if you have a friend or family member who is struggling with sexual addiction and they are not getting professional help, that you encourage them to do that. That
Mhm.
you are asking, have you found resources? And if so, what are those resources? How can we support you around those resources? We know that it can be financially taxing at times to be in groups and seeing a counselor, maybe doing couples work. And so we know how helpful that is for families to step up and say, can we support you in this way? That's an
Right.
incredibly helpful way.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be with you here again today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you today?
I am doing well. It's
And
good to
we
be
have,
here.
well, it's great to have you, and it's great to also have Greg's wife, Beth Miller, joining us. We're doing this via Zoom today because we're in three different locations at the moment. So
Mhm.
happy to have you with us as well, Beth.
Yeah, so glad to be here.
So today we decided that it would be a great idea to do a podcast about what is helpful and what is unhelpful for families and friends early on in recovery.
Mm.
Yeah. And, Beth, you and I have been talking about this. And so why don't you just kind of talk about why we thought this would be a helpful podcast, kind of where the idea came from?
Yeah. Well, what I became aware of as I sat and listened to a lot of my clients talk about their own pain with the chaos of what's been unfolding around sexual addiction. What also is true for many is that they have additional layers of pain in how their family or their friends are reacting, or how they're not responding, how maybe
Right.
they've shut them out. And
Mhm.
so I thought it could be really helpful for us to have a conversation around what are some things that aren't helpful and what are some things that are. And the audience today may be initially those of you that regularly tune in to our Faithful and True podcast. And you may be thinking, oh, I have some friends or family that I think could benefit from hearing some coaching around how to support us. And then maybe you are those friends or family that have taken this invitation to get educated around how you can best support your loved one. And if that's the case, we so affirm that you are here listening to this.
Absolutely. We also want to
Yeah.
validate that this people's reactions and responses can come from a really good and loving place. It is their
Yeah.
desire as a friend or a family member to respond well. But the reality is they may simply not know what that is, and
Yeah.
they are reacting out of old patterns or old understandings. And so part of what we're wanting to do is for those friends and family that do want to respond and do want to express love, some of the things that we are aware of that can be helpful, some of the things that can be hurtful. And also, this is not just for spouses, but this can also be true for the person who's struggling with the addiction and their behavior now has been exposed. Maybe family, friends know about it. And how do
Yeah.
we respond to that person also?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just start off, Beth. What would you say are some of the things that are helpful? What are some things that people experience that really can be beneficial for them in their recovery?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that can be especially helpful is asking the person themselves, whether that's the spouse or the one struggling with the addiction, what do you need? And then trusting that that person will find their way with this, that
Hmm.
they actually know what's best for them. So often, I think what we define or discover is that friends and family, in a desire to want to be supportive, start giving advice. And often it's very uninformed advice. And so it is helpful to say, what do you need? And how can I support you in that?
Right. And one of the things, especially for the person struggling with the addiction, and I also think this is true for spouses, one of the things that we're working on is helping them to identify what their needs are. In most of our groups, part of the check-in is what are your needs? And so it is helpful for someone to be asked, and then they get to articulate what they think would be helpful for them in that situation. And, one of the things that can be true is a lot of times the answer is, I'm not sure or I don't know. And in that case, maybe there can be a conversation. Maybe the friend or the family member can offer some things that they could do to see if that might be helpful. But instead of it just being a decision or an announcement, this is what I'm going to do to be helpful, that it begins with a conversation where the voice of the person who has been affected by the addiction or is also struggling with the addiction, and they get to identify what they might need.
Mm-hmm. I think another really helpful thing, if you have a friend or family member who is struggling with sexual addiction and they are not getting professional help, that you encourage them to do that. That you are asking, have you found resources? And if so, what are those resources? How can we support you around those resources? We know that it can be financially taxing at times to be in groups and seeing a counselor, maybe doing couples work. And so we know how helpful that is for families to step up and say, can we support you in this way? That's an
Right.
incredibly helpful way.
Yeah.
And I would add without strings, right?
Yeah.
That we're going to help you as long as this goes the way we think it should go, right? Rather than trusting the process and prayerfully supporting your family member as they are seeking the help and the wisdom of that help.
Well, and even having an agenda of where a person should seek out help. Sometimes we have this opinion of where someone should go, maybe what is the best resource, what might be the best approach. And so one of the things that as friends and family we're trying to do is surrender our control and to surrender our agenda so that the other person, out of their own understanding, out of their own experience, they can be making choices. Now, what can be complicated, especially for the person that's struggling with the addiction, they have a history of not making good choices. And so when someone struggling with addiction starts to try to choose recovery, we can be suspicious of their ability to choose well. And so we can acknowledge that it can be challenging, but it's also important that we begin to trust the person as they are choosing recovery, as they're trying to discern what would be helpful for them. And again, if we have a question about something, instead of just making a proclamation, may we invite someone into a conversation about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think something else that is really helpful is when we allow ourselves to really hold confidentiality. That this may feel like a story that we should tell someone else. We may feel like we should tell other friends. Maybe we should tell the rest of the family. And maybe it's even coming out of a good heart. Our belief is the more people who know, the more people will be able to help.
Yeah.
But what we
More
know
support.
over and over again is that this is someone's story. And as soon as they feel like they've lost control of the story, or there are people who know that maybe they wanted to tell, or maybe even they wouldn't have told, it becomes really complicated. So, one of the things I would say that can be really helpful is when a friend or a family member trusts you with this information, that you also hold confidence. Now, in some situations, let's say a child tells one of his or her parents about what's going on. And I think it's important to even ask in that situation, is it okay if I share this with your mother or with your father? And again, allowing the person to have that choice. What can be complicated is if a child asks a parent to hold confidence from their spouse, it may be important to try to figure out what that's going to look like.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, but absolutely, confidentiality is so important. And, you know, when friends are telling friends or family members are telling family members, and then it comes back to the people who are most directly affected, that's more emotional weight to carry. And they need all the emotional capacity and heavy lifting for what's going on in their own relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, if there's someone that, a family member or a friend has been told this information, and there is someone that that person genuinely thinks would be helpful to know, again, you ask permission to be able to say, would it be all right if I shared this with whoever the person may be? Again, allowing the person who is most affected by this to have
Mhm.
choice, to have a voice, and in that decision is who's being told.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I think back to our own situation, uh, 20 some years ago, almost 20 years ago, one of the things that really stands out to me was how friends came along and got educated. And that's a huge help. I vividly remember one of my dearest friends reading one of Patrick Carnes' books, Don't Call It Love. And, we were on the phone one night late and she was reading things out loud to me. And it was so hopeful as I was getting educated about sexual addiction and compulsivity. Also, like the profound love that communicated.
Mhm.
I'm like teary thinking about it now,
Mhm.
that many years later. It was such an investment in me and then also you and us,
Mhm.
right? And so, friends and family, for those of you that are listening to this, I just really encourage you get educated. There's so many good resources out there um, about what this is. I think of Mark's book, Healing the Wounds of Sexual Addictions, and Debbie's book, Shattered Vows. Those are really primers, as we like to say around here. But boy, you could love your people well by getting educated about what kind of deep water they're trying to swim in.
Right. And what I think is important about that is you mentioned it. The more people get educated, the more they do experience hope. We do believe that there's a way forward. We do believe that you don't have to live in the chaos of addiction, that you don't have to be held in that bondage. Now, it is dependent upon people's willingness to do the work of recovery, but to even have an understanding that there is hope, there is a way forward, can really be significant. As I think of the story that you're telling, part of the thing that was so meaningful for me in the story is she was one of the first people that you really trusted that said, I think there's hope for you and Greg.
Yeah.
And, I could say that and I could hope that there was hope. But for a trusted friend to be able to say that, it just had more meaning. And so, really, clarity from family and friends as they're getting educated is this amazing gift that you're able to give someone.
Mhm. I think another thing along those lines is depending on, friends and family, depending on your connection with uh, the folks that are dealing with this addiction and how close you are to it, you may need to get some support yourself.
Mhm.
Um, Particularly, I think of parents of adult children. Sometimes parents may feel really triggered into their shame that their child is the one who is acted out, or their child is the one who is staying in a marriage where they have been betrayed. You may have all kinds of big feelings about what's happening in your adult child's marriage. And that's understandable. It really is. And you can love them well by taking good care of yourself and getting some support.
Right.
Um,
Because
and it's,
there
yeah,
there can be a temptation for the friend or the parent or the family member, when they hear this information, they become triggered and they may want to go back to the person at the center of this and try to process it. And they just don't have the capacity to hear that or
That's
be
right.
with you. And so it's important that you are getting support and acknowledging that support may not be able to come from the person who really is in the midst of this, at the center of the chaos. We also see that this can be very triggering if some sort of sexual acting out, some sort of unfaithfulness, some sort of use of pornography is in their particular life. So when a child tells a parent and the parent has struggled with this, or it's been in their parent's marriage, it's so close, it's so personal that that informs the way that they react. And so it is important that if this is a part of your story, and someone is telling you this, that you're getting the help and the support that you need to process what is happening to your family member, as well as what's getting triggered in you based upon your own history.
Hmm. Yeah. I think another thing that is so important is that you, as friends or family, are willing to not see the person dealing with the addiction and their spouse as the identified patients in your life. And what I mean by that is you're willing to consider how you may also have pain and or some addictive behavior, things like that in your own life. What we see over and over, and it's so painful, is that out of a place of fear, a lot of self-righteousness really develops. And the ones in the deep weeds of the addiction get isolated, and other people move away as if to communicate, we have it all together. I've seen this happen a lot in friend groups in particular, and it's so, so painful. This is the time to come around, right? And I think of the story that I often have heard Mark and Debbie Laaser tell over the years, that when Mark was intervened upon, there was a kind man in that group of people who said, you know, Mark, I have a feeling that your addiction is similar to my own struggles with alcohol.
Yeah.
And right, he didn't make Mark the only one with an issue, and he was communicating empathy and compassion and his own humanity in that.
Yeah.
And that creates such safety. Now, it doesn't minimize, like in that situation, that didn't minimize the work that Mark needed to do, of course. And I think of how often I've heard that story, and chances are it's because it was so profoundly meaningful to the two of them that someone was willing to name it rather than cast Mark in a light that he needed to be isolated. Right?
Yeah. Well, and for many people, like you said, out of their fear, their reaction is to push the person away or the couple away who is struggling. And it can be a lot about judgment. And this is the worst story we've ever heard, or we have never heard anything like this before, or even the judgment of there's no hope. And so to really set that judgment aside, one of the principles we talk a lot about in recovery is don't compare, identify. And in everybody's story, there's something that we can identify with. And so one of the best things that we can do to love people well, to serve people well, is instead of comparing their story to somebody else's, we simply find what in their story we can identify with. I think another thing that is helpful is to be willing to live in the andness of the situation and of the people. And we talk about our andness a lot at Faithful and True, that we're not either or, we're not good or bad, we're not either right or wrong or in and out. And there's a complexity to who we are. And one thing that we see sometimes is, let's say that the parents of the addict want to minimize what their child has done and just focus on that this is their son, they love their son, this is a good son. And in minimizing what their son has done, they're also minimizing their daughter-in-law's pain.
Yeah.
Or it can go the other extreme where we no longer see anything good in the addict and we just focus on the negative. And sometimes we see the parents of the spouse doing that, or the family or friends of the spouse doing that, for fear that if we acknowledge anything good in the other person, the addict, we're minimizing or we're communicating loyalty. And I think one of the best gifts that we can give is to understand the andness of that person who's struggling with addiction, that there are these good parts of who they are, and they have significantly hurt someone that they care and love about through their addictive choices.
Yeah.
And so allowing ourselves to be in that complexity of who we are as people.
Yeah. I also think it would be helpful for us to just name some specific kinds of things that we've heard over the years that are not helpful. And again, we offer these with grace. If you are listening, maybe you think, oh, geez, we've done some of these things, or I've said something that resonates with this list. You know what? We can repair and we can own. So I think one of the things that I want to encourage is that we are not pressuring a loved one to make a decision to either stay or leave. Trust me, they're struggling enough with the weight of navigating through new information, new discoveries, disclosures, trying to find their way forward. And it only adds complication and complexity if a friend or family member keeps saying, what are you going to do? Have you made a decision? Haven't you already, had enough time or gotten enough information? Those kind of things really just tend to trigger shame in someone that they should be further down the road.
Well, and it also dismisses the complexity of the decision itself. And
Yeah.
what we often say is that in order to make an informed decision, you need good information. And what we know specifically around addiction is it sometimes takes a while for all of the information to come out, so that not just in the acting out, but in the consequences of the acting out or the implications of the acting out. That many times takes a while. And so if we quickly make a decision about what we're going to do, we may be making it without all the pertinent information. And I think many times our push for someone else to make a decision is simply our desire to feel safer and more comfortable, that we don't like the uncertainty, we don't like the ambiguity. And, I easily can use your parents, Beth, as an example of really great things to do. And I always felt very supported by them, and they never rushed to try to make something happen when it wasn't time yet. And I can remember them saying to me, Greg, we support you, Greg, we love you, and we don't know what's going to happen in your marriage. And so they were creating space for there to be this uncertainty as you got the information that you needed. And part of the information that you needed was, am I going to take recovery seriously? Are you seeing a change in me? Are you experiencing me as different? And that especially takes time. And so allowing, yourself to be patient as your family member or your friend is just needing some time to figure out what the next step might be.
I think along those same lines is it's important not to pressure your friend or family member into quick forgiveness. Quick forgiveness is not forgiveness. It's just way more complex than that. And someone can be in the process of forgiving. And part of the process may be that they are angry, that they are feeling some big feelings and so forth. That doesn't mean they're not on that journey. But I know I was very quickly encouraged uh, by someone in my life to forgive. And I think we were 3 weeks in,
Mhm.
and it just wasn't feasible at that time,
Right.
nor
And
would it have been helpful or served us.
well, and it also doesn't acknowledge the ongoing process of forgiveness, as if
Yeah,
forgiveness is a one and done kind of experience. So even when a person feels like they are ready to engage the process of forgiveness, it's still a process. It's still going to take time. And
yeah,
many times, again, we want that push for forgiveness because we believe then everything can be made better and that we can just move on. It's amazing how much energy there is, both by the people struggling with the addiction and their spouses, with family members and friends. We just desperately want to move on quickly, and that isn't even an option or a possibility.
hmm I think another thing that I've seen that's not been helpful is when someone gives advice, they believe they know what the next step should be. And then when, their loved one goes a different way, they basically leave the relationship. They shut them out. Um, and I just want to say how painful that is, whether it's family or friends. If it's family, one of the things we've seen sometimes is adult children, especially in the early weeks or months, may turn to their parents for some advice. The advice that the parents give may not be what ultimately is the wisest choice. And then the parents um, feel upset or bothered or hurt, that the adult children didn't take their advice. And really, it's the children, the adult children's work of differentiating, right,
Mhm.
from their parents, which may feel new in some cases. That doesn't mean it's bad. And likewise for friends, you may feel like you have a really clear idea of what your friend should be doing. And when they are walking this journey and end up doing something else, and it could be staying or leaving in the relationship, seek to understand rather than just leave the table, because that creates so much more pain.
Yeah.
Seek to say, help me understand, um, help like help me to give me some understanding of what all you've been learning. Tell me why this feels like a wise decision for you, and as much as possible without judgment or
Right.
energy around that question.
Well, and what's also true is, let's say that the person makes a decision and the decision doesn't play out well, they're especially going to need support at that point. And so, and it's not the support of I told you so, you should have listened to me, but
Yeah,
it's the support that comes from I'm with you on this journey as you try to find your way forward. They're the person making the decisions are learning, they're getting new information, they're trying to make the decisions that are wisest, and they're not always going to choose well. And when they don't choose well, they especially need their community and their family with them.
yeah,
And that kind of brings me to another thing. One of the things I don't think is helpful is when we turn people into either villains, victims, or heroes in these stories. I often say there are no villains, there are no heroes, there's just people. And sometimes to create safety, the addict becomes the villain in the story, and the person, the spouse, becomes either the victim or the heroine in the story. And that approach really doesn't serve anyone because everybody's people, everybody is hurting, everybody's in chaos. And we may not agree or believe that a choice somebody made is good. We may see the hurt that that choice is causing somebody else, but it's important that we don't make that person a villain because then we will just push them out and separate ourselves from them. And
yeah.
that's one of the things that, Beth, your parents did amazingly well. I
Mm,
never felt like I was the villain. There were consequences of my choices. They had reactions to the things that I had done, but it wasn't as if I became the villain. I was held accountable for my choices, and they could still be with me in that.
Yeah. I think just a couple more very quick things. Um, I think it's not helpful to ask a lot of invasive questions. I get, as a friend or a family member, you may be thinking, what in the world has happened? And when you start asking invasive questions, especially to the betrayed partner, things like, what was going on in your marriage? Were things in trouble? That sort of implication really is sending the message that somehow the spouse is to blame there. I also think in the Christian community, one of the things we've seen a lot is where someone makes this a moral problem only, and they begin to make assumptions that, well, he couldn't have been a true believer, couldn't have been a true Christ follower if he made these decisions. And I don't think that our salvation is dependent upon our acting out or not, right? Like, I think that is not helpful to tie it to that. Greg, I've heard you often say that it doesn't help to offer a simple solution to a complex problem.
Right.
And I think that sort of summary does that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the idea that, well, if you were just a better Christian, you wouldn't be doing this, with no acknowledgement of the complexity of addiction and the role that brain chemistry plays, and how we may be medicating old pain from the past. And again, none of that dismisses the moral reality of acting out sexually and betraying other people. And it's not an excuse for what somebody does. It just gives us a greater context of understanding. And if salvation is a relationship that's not defined by our behavior, then our behavior can't change that relationship.
yeah,
That's the beauty of grace, that God can be with us wherever we are, whatever we're doing, because God's grace and God's love transcends our choices and our circumstances. And so, we do sometimes want to just rush a simple solution. Well, just pray more, or go to church more, or read the scripture more. And all of those are good things. They can build us and support us. And there's so much more to this issue that really needs to be addressed. I often say this isn't a problem you solve. This is a wound that needs to be healed. And there's a lot of things that we can resource that will help to bring healing to the wound.
yeah.
Well, Beth and Greg, this has been really, really great conversation. Appreciate you both and your experience and outlook on this very complicated issue. But hopefully our listeners and our viewers will really benefit from this conversation today. Beth, thank you so much for joining us from Chicago. And Greg, as always, we look forward to having you lead the Men's Journey workshop here starting tomorrow morning. So thank you very much for joining us. For our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that today's conversation has maybe opened your eyes to either how you can seek the help that you're looking for. If you're looking for the resources that Beth and Greg were referencing at the beginning of this podcast, we hope that you will investigate Faithful and True and go to our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many effective resources for you. We've got our online bookstore. We have over 550 podcasts like this one, and we have all of the online information and registration for our 3-day intensive workshops. We offer the Men's Journey workshop every month. We offer the Women's workshop and the couples. We have two distinct couples workshops that we've got coming up in the new year, and we're going to do another podcast kind of outlining what makes these two events unique from each other. So be watching for that podcast coming to you soon. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week with many blessings and with great vision.